Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Anne and today I'm going to do a quick recap of the books I've read in 2019. I just finished the last book I wanted to read this year, which was Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, and that makes this the perfect time to do my recap for the year. I've got a list of 10 favorite books of 2019 and 5 most disappointing books of 2019. I've got my laptop here, so that's what I'm looking at. And I just wanted to quickly go through them and through my reading year in general. I do apologize for the glare on my glasses. I think they might be a little distracting, but that's just the fate of having to wear glasses, I guess. So please bear with me. So as for the stats of 2019, I've read 55 books this year, and that's a total of 19,545 pages. And I think that's a record for me. I have never read more than 50 books in a year. The longest book I read in 2019 is In the Presence of the Enemy by Elizabeth George, which has 656 pages, and the shortest book I read was A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle, which had 123 pages. These are all the stats from Goodreads, by the way, so you can just find them on your profile and you'll have a list there with the books you've read and these stats. But yeah, those were the short stats. Let's now get into my 10 favorite books of 2019. These were all 5 or 4.5 star reads, I think. At least all of them were 5 stars on Goodreads, where you still can't do half stars. There's no specific order to these. Apart from the last two, those were my 2 absolute favorite books of the year. So I'll just go through them very quickly. There's The Boy Who Steals Houses by C.G. Drews, aka Paper Fury, on Twitter, Instagram and her blog. I've known Kate for a couple of years now around the book community, and her first book, 1,000 Perfect Notes, came out last year, I think, or maybe the year before that, and I really liked that one, but this one really blew me away. The Boy Who Steals Houses is a Goldilocks retelling, and it's about a boy named Sam and his brother Avery, and Avery is autistic, and Sam and Avery live on the streets because their family is abusive and everyone has betrayed and left them. And sometimes they steal houses, meaning they enter a house that's clearly empty and has been for a while because the owners are on vacation or some such, and they sleep there just so they don't have to sleep on the streets. And then one day Sam enters a house which he thinks is empty, but it isn't, and he kind of rolls into the whirlwind of the Delaney family, and he experiences what it's like to be in a loving family, and it's very heart-wrenching but also heartwarming. His relationship with his brother Avery is very complex and heartbreaking, and I don't remember if I actually shed a couple of tears, but it's very likely because this was amazing. Book 2 and 3 are actually part of a duology, and they are This Savage Song and Our Dark Duet by V.E. Schwab. These two are the first 2 Schwabs I've read. I've been meaning to read a V.E. Schwab book for quite some time now because I've heard so many good things about them, and I had This Savage Song on my shelves and it had been there for a while, so I figured I'd finally read it, and I was really excited afterwards because I absolutely loved it, and I think I found a new favorite author, even though I've only read these 2 books, but they were really great, and I've got the Shades of Magic series on my shelves waiting to be read as well, so I hope to get to them in 2020. These books are urban fantasy. I'm not sure if it's that or dystopian, but it's about a city that's divided in 2, and there are monsters, and there are 2 main characters. We've got Kate Harker and August Flynn, and Kate Harker is the daughter of one of the rulers of this city, of one half, and August Flynn is the monster son of the ruler of the other half. And as you might be able to guess, those 2 rulers of the cities don't really agree on things, to put it mildly, and war happens, a lot of violence happens, but a lot of really beautiful things happen as well. These 2 characters obviously meet and they build a relationship of some sort, and after This Savage Song I didn't really know what was going to happen in Our Dark Duet, because it did seem a little final. There were a lot of open ends, but I didn't really know how she was going to pick things up in Our Dark Duet, but I really loved it. And I gave both of these 5 stars, I think. Next up, there's Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. I'm still not sure how to pronounce her name, but I absolutely loved her book. This is a collection of short stories, and I've been unable to explain what they're about for over a year, I think. So I'll just read the thing on the back that captured my attention to you as well. 8 startling stories that map the realities of women's lives and the violence visited upon their bodies. Earthy and otherworldly, antic and sexy, queer and caustic, comic and deadly serious, Her Body and Other Parties enlarges the possibilities of contemporary fiction. So there were 8 stories, and they were all very different. They had different genres as well. There was magical realism, there was dystopian, there was just plain horror type things. But they all felt like they belonged to a whole as well. Not because they interlinked in some way, but just because they were about women and the female experience, and they were all grisly and uncanny and uncomfortable in some way. And I've never read anything like it, really. It was so original, yet felt so classical in a good way as well, and so revolutionary too. And I really recommend this one if you're into feminism and just really good short stories. Next up, there's On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. Together with The Boy Who Steals Houses, this was my most anticipated release for 2019. I read The Hate You Give in 2017, I think, and it was one of my favorite books of the year. So I couldn't wait to read this, and I absolutely loved it. This is a story about Bree, who lives in the same neighborhood as Star, who is the protagonist of The Hate You Give, but they don't know each other, and Bree lives a very different life. She and her family are very poor, and they sometimes have trouble putting food on the table for themselves. And to save their family from poverty, Bree wants to become a rapper, just like her father was before he was killed. This is a story about ambition and wanting to take care of your family. It's a story about racism and discrimination, and about the unfairness of life and the unfairness of being born into a life that's so much less privileged than other people's lives. Basically, being black in America in a poor neighborhood versus being white, perhaps even in the same neighborhood. This story, like The Hate You Give, really struck a chord with me, and it felt so emotional, and I had a lot of feelings reading it, let's just put it like that. And I definitely recommend this one, just like The Hate You Give, to everyone. Next up, there's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This is a very different book. It's a classic. It was published in 1848, so by far the oldest book on my list. And it was also on my list of 10 books I want to read in 2019, because I love the Bronte sisters. They're really fascinating to me. Wuthering Heights is one of my favorite books of all time, if not the favorite book of all time for me. And I'd never read anything by Anne Bronte, the third Bronte sister, before, so I wanted to do that this year. And I was very pleasantly surprised, because I figured I'd like the book, just like with Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, but not much more than that. But I ended up liking this more than Jane Eyre, and even though Wuthering Heights will always be my favorite, just for nostalgic and emotional reasons, I think maybe this might be even better than that. I must say, right now a good summary eludes me, so that's a bit of a bummer for this video, but I can say that it is a very feminist novel, at least for the time. And it also says here on the back, Wildfell Hall can be said to be the first sustained feminist novel. So that really captured my interest as well, because I'm a feminist, I like reading about feminism and I like reading feminist novels. So reading a book from the 19th century and it having very feminist undertones, it was really exciting to me, and the story ended up being really good as well. I'm trying to remember the story, which isn't a very good sign, but I did really love it. It's about a woman who has married a man who she at first thought was a good man, but then he ends up being a bastard, basically. And it's about her and the unfairness of having to live with this man, and the unfairness of being a woman and not having a place to go. You have to marry or you'll end up very poor. And that's the gist of it. And I'm going to leave it at that. Next up, there's Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. This is a graphic novel from the 80s, and it's been very influential in the graphic novel genre in general, I think. And my boyfriend recommended this to me. He really loved it and he thought I'd love it as well, and he was completely right. It's about these masked vigilantes or heroes who used to keep the streets of, I think it was New York, safe, but then gain a bit of a bad reputation because people feel like these vigilantes are taking the law in their own hands and the government is just letting them, so they are banned. But then shit happens and they are kind of forced to get back together when one of them is killed, and they have to deal with a possible nuclear war to end all wars. That's basically the gist of it. I really should have prepared my summaries better. But what I loved most about this book is the way it's structured. You get little bits and pieces of information that help you to piece together the puzzle of the story, but these pieces are given to you very deliberately at very deliberate points in the story, which was just masterfully done. And in between all of the chapters there are just regular novel type stories as well, which give you background on the characters or on the situation in the country or whatever. And it took me a chapter or two to really get into it, but then I was completely hooked, and it was so exciting to read this book. And knowing that it has influenced an entire genre, and really understanding why it has, because this is a masterpiece, I think. This is Anne from a few minutes after I finished filming this video, when I realized that I forgot one of the books on my top 10, because I don't have a physical copy and it's a book I listened to on audiobook, and that's The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. The Unhoneymooners is a romance novel that has the hate to love trope in it, and I wasn't expecting much when I went into it, to be honest, but I was excited to finally read a Christina Lauren romance novel. But I ended up really loving it. I ended up laughing out loud a lot. I was really rooting for these two characters, and I was really invested in their romance and in their story. I just had a really good time reading it, and that's worth a lot to me. It doesn't have to be the greatest piece of literature of all time or anything. It just has to make me happy or has to make me think, and in this instance this book really made me happy, and I really want to read more by Christina Lauren. So yeah, back to and with the lipstick and the not Christmas sweater. Then before I get to my two favorite books of 2019, I have an honorable mention, which is 1984 by George Orwell. I read this in high school and reread it this year, thinking that I would be able to appreciate it more now that I have a full grasp of the English language and a full grasp of everything that's going on politically in this book. And I was right, this has become a new favorite of mine, a new all-time favorite. I made an entire video on it, so if you want to watch that, I'll link it up above. I didn't want to put this on in my top 10 because it's a reread, but I did want to mention it because it ended up being an absolute favorite. So yeah. Then my top two favorite books of 2019. I didn't want to choose between these two because they were both great in their own way, and they are The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet and Daisy Jones and the Six. So I'll talk about The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet first. This is the first book in a sci-fi trilogy written by Becky Chambers, and it's unlike any other sci-fi I've ever read because the story is quite small. It's about getting to a planet and getting there safe, and of course there are problems along the way, the biggest problem being getting there safe, but it isn't a story of big events that can change the course of history or something, like with the book I'm going to mention in my most disappointing books, Aurora Rising. Just a quick spoiler. This is mostly character driven and not plot driven at all, and it's about different races coming together and discrimination as well. But because this is set in space, it isn't about the racial discussions we have on our planet, but it's about the human race and other races, alien races, and it was an interesting way to see racism and discrimination depicted and to really get into it as well. Because I believe in this book the human race isn't seen as the superior race at all. In fact, they are the refugees, they are the lesser ones, as they are regarded by some of the other races. And that was interesting to see. It's very different from what you usually see, with humans being the messiahs and the saviors and the good ones, the smart ones. So that was fun. And the story of this book is set on a ship, the Wayfarer, and within that ship there are people from different races and from different backgrounds, and you learn more about them and about their background and their relationships with each other. And I loved it so much. I read it on holiday in Germany, and every time I think about this book I just feel warm inside. I wasn't expecting this to be a new favorite at all. I picked it up mostly because I loved the cover and the title, and the back sounded pretty cool, sounded a bit like Firefly, but I didn't think it would be so good and it would impact me so much. It was just a heartwarming story and it made me feel happy and warm, and I love it, and it's my favorite. And then Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I think most of BookTube will know what this book is about, and I think I'm not the only one who's put it on their list for 2019. I read this on audiobook, and I definitely recommend it if you haven't read this yet and you have access to the audiobook, because there's a full cast of characters and this story isn't told in a normal narrative. It's told as in an interview type format, almost like a play basically, and that really works very well in an audiobook format. And I loved it so much afterwards that I bought the book. I don't usually do that. I only listen to audiobooks if I don't own the physical copy, because I figured, well, why waste time and money on an audiobook if I have the physical book and can read it like that? But I listened to the audiobook. I ordered it right away because I definitely want to reread it. I kind of wanted to reread it after I finished it right away. But to give you a very quick summary, this story is about a band, Daisy Jones and the Six, and they were popular in the 70s. They recorded an album that became extremely popular and made them very famous, but then afterwards the band broke up, and this is a story of why they broke up and what led to that breakup and everything that happened, and it was amazing. I love 70s music, so I loved all the references to other bands and just the time period in general, and I loved learning about the band dynamics. Even though this isn't a real band, it felt like a real band, just the way everyone talked about it and the way the characters jumped off the, I want to say page, but of course I listened to it, so out of the earbuds I guess. It all felt very real and very authentic, and it made me fall in love with the book and with the characters. And then near the end something is revealed and I broke a little inside. I remember I was on a bus listening to the story, and I had to keep in the tears because I really wanted to cry, but I felt that would be a little embarrassing to do on a bus. But yeah, definitely a favorite. This book is amazing and I highly recommend it. So those were my 10 favorite books of 2019. I realized I've rambled on for quite some time now, so this is going to be a pretty long video, even though I decided I didn't want to make very long videos anymore. But I also quickly want to go through my most disappointing books of the year. Luckily there's only 5 of those, and I don't want to talk about them as long as I did the other ones, because I don't like being a negative Nancy, but I want to mention them quickly. First of all, there's Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. I really wanted to love this because it's a fantasy story set in a West African inspired society, and the magic system of which is inspired by West African mythology, and that's amazing to me, and I love that this story is out there for people to enjoy. It also touches upon racism a lot, and I really like that. I think it's important for doing that. But when I just look at the characters and the plot of the book, I didn't like it. It felt too flat for me. The characters were not very original or defined. They were just characters, they did their things, they went through the motions, but I didn't really feel them, and the plot was very predictable to me. I predicted what would happen, I predicted how or that these characters were going to get out of sticky situations, and that took all of the suspense out of it. This is a story with very high stakes, but to me they didn't feel like high stakes because I just knew how things were going to work out. And I've also realized I don't really like fantasy stories with a magic system that are based on the gods and on whether the gods will grant you something or not, or whether the gods like you or not, because then things become very arbitrary. But that's something that's maybe good to discuss in a separate video. But yeah, unfortunately I was disappointed by this, and I don't think I'll pick up the second book in the series, which came out earlier this month, or even in November perhaps. Next up, there's The Silence of the Girls, which I could rant about for a very long time. This is by far my least favorite book of 2019. This is a retelling of the Trojan War from the perspective of women. At least that's what's promised. And for the first half or the first third of the story, that's what you get. Only then, when part 2 rolls around, suddenly Achilles gets a voice, and the story is all about Achilles instead of Briseis, who is the main character. This is a story about poor Achilles and everything that's done to him. He's not a nice character, and I don't think he was meant to be a nice character or meant to be portrayed as a nice character, but the fact that the story ends up being about him when we are promised the story about the girls in this story just pisses me off a lot. If you want to write a story about Achilles, go ahead, be my guest. I've heard that The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller is a very good story. I want to read that as well. But at least then you know it's going to be about Achilles. And with this story I was so excited to read about women in Greek mythology and what they went through, their point of view, but that's not what we got. The women were just put aside after a third of the story, when it felt almost as if Pat Barker figured, I don't really have much to say about this, I'd much rather write about Achilles, and just went that way halfway through. So yeah, angry about this, my least favorite book of 2019. Next up, there's Aurora Rising by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. I made an entire video about this, so I'm not going to talk about this for too long. I loved Illuminae and the other 2 books in that series by these 2 authors, which was also sci-fi just like this, but this just fell flat for me. I didn't like the characters, I was really annoyed by them, I didn't like the plot. It was just not believable or too predictable for me. I'm not sure what it was, I was just really annoyed all the way through. And I really wanted to love this, but I just wasn't invested at all, so I'm not going to continue this series either. It did get a little better at the end, but that wasn't enough for me to like this book. Then we're getting to the last 2, the first of which is The Sun is Also a Star by Nicola Yoon. I read this book because I wanted to see the film, and I have to say I did like the book a lot more than I did the film. It's about 2 people, a boy and a girl, who basically fall in love in a day. Natasha has found out that she has to leave the country with her family because they're illegal immigrants and they are being thrown out of the country. So she has one day to make people change their minds. So that's what she has going on in her head, and I don't even remember what Daniel has going on. But Natasha is from Jamaica and Daniel has a Korean family, I want to say. I hope that's true. It's been a while since I read this. And it's about different cultures, and I did like the focus on culture, and I like learning more about these different cultures within America, but I just didn't buy the whole connection between them and their relationship, I guess. So that was a bit of a bummer for me, because I know a lot of people love this. And then the last book on my list of disappointing books from 2019 is If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino. It's in theory a very cool story about, how do I explain this? It's multiple stories within one book. It's basically about someone who buys a book, finds out it's not the book he thought it would be, returns the book, gets another version of the book, it's something entirely different. I don't remember it exactly. It's a very cool concept and I've wanted to read it for years. And I like the concept, but I hated the fact that women were treated horribly in this book. And not even treated horribly, they were just diminished to women the way they were portrayed in this time. I think this book was written in... Okay, it was published in the 80s, so it's not as old as I thought it would be, but it's clearly a white man writing about women, and not even masking the fact that he thinks they're not as good as men. And that just pisses me off. I have a very low threshold when it comes to tolerating these things. I just get angry, and even though the story is good, because the story was pretty good, I didn't like the book. So that's my wrap up of 2019. In the meantime, the sun is already going down, so the light has changed a lot in this video. You can hear my guinea pig drinking water on the background. I had a great reading year. I am very happy with the books I read, with how I like the books I read. I hope you had a great reading year as well. Please let me know some of your favorite books of the year, and perhaps even some of your least favorite books, or maybe you've read one of the books that are on either of my lists and you have something to say about that. I hope you all have a very happy new year, and I'll see you in 2020. Bye!